On January 14, 2026, President Donald Trump posted a statement on Truth Social that European capitals are still scrambling to process. He wrote that the United States needs Greenland for national security, called it vital for the missile defense system he's building, and then declared that anything less than full U.S. control is unacceptable. Not undesirable, not inconvenient, unacceptable. That same day, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down in Washington with Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Greenland's Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt. These were not casual diplomatic check-ins. These were high-stakes meetings aimed at de-escalation after weeks of escalating U.S. pressure. A bipartisan congressional delegation is also scheduled to fly to Copenhagen later this week. The situation has moved beyond rhetoric into formal negotiations. Here's why this matters right now. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. Greenland is Danish territory, and a sitting American president has now publicly refused to accept anything other than transferring that territory to U.S. hands. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen warned that a U.S. military takeover would mean the end of NATO and the collapse of the post-World War II security architecture that has defined the Western alliance for nearly 80 years. This isn't speculation. This is the Danish leader explicitly stating the stakes, and this comes with a price tag. According to NBC News, estimates compiled by scholars and former U.S. officials put the potential cost of acquiring Greenland at between $500 billion and $700 billion. That figure accounts for the island's sheer size, over 800,000 square miles, its strategic position in the Arctic, and its vast deposits of rare earth minerals. To put that in perspective, $700 billion exceeds half of the U.S. Department of Defense's entire annual budget. So the headline is not exaggeration. These talks have begun. The demand has been made public, and the financial and diplomatic frameworks are already being assembled behind closed doors. Now let's get into how we got here, and what this means for everyone involved. Trump's interest in Greenland is not new. He first floated the idea back in 2019, describing it as a large real estate deal tied to U.S. security interests. That statement strained relations with Denmark, led to canceled diplomatic visits, and was widely dismissed at the time as an oddity. But that was 6 years ago. Since then, Trump has returned to office, and the Greenland proposal has returned with him, except this time, the tone has shifted dramatically. In December 2024, Trump called U.S. ownership of Greenland an absolute necessity for national security and freedom. He's repeatedly refused to rule out military options. At one point, he suggested the U.S. would acquire it the easy way or the hard way. In January 2026, he posted that if the U.S. doesn't take Greenland, Russia or China will, and that's not going to happen. This isn't diplomatic positioning. This is a demand. And the framing around national security is deliberate. Trump has explicitly tied Greenland to the Golden Dome, a proposed U.S. missile defense system. Greenland sits at a geographic choke point for monitoring threats over the North Pole. It's home to Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, which operates early warning radar systems capable of detecting intercontinental ballistic missiles. This base already exists under a 1951 U.S.-Denmark defense agreement. The U.S. already has military access, so the question becomes, why push for full ownership? The answer, according to Trump's own statements, is control, not just access. Control. That distinction matters, because the current agreement gives the U.S. operational capacity while keeping Greenland under Danish sovereignty. Trump's position is that shared arrangements are no longer sufficient, and he wants NATO, the alliance of which Denmark is a founding member, to help him secure it. That's where the real tension begins. NATO was built on the principle of collective defense. Article 5 says an attack on one member is an attack on all. For nearly 80 years, this framework has held. But now, the United States, the most powerful NATO member, is publicly pressuring another member to hand over territory. And if that pressure turns into action, the entire logic of the alliance collapses. Frederiksen said it plainly. If the US uses military force to take Greenland from Denmark, that would be the end of NATO. Not a crisis. The end. Because the moment one NATO country attacks another NATO country to seize land, Article 5 becomes meaningless. The Mutual Defense Clause only works if members trust that they won't become targets of each other, and it's not just Denmark raising this alarm. EU Defense Commissioner Andreas Kubilius echoed the warning, stating that any US action would mark NATO's end. Former EU Commissioner Margrethe Vestager called Trump's ambitions an existential threat to the alliance. French Foreign Minister Sébastien Barrot denounced what he called US blackmail. Norway's foreign minister described the push as alliance-breaking. A joint statement from leaders of Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom affirmed that Greenland belongs to its people and that it is for Denmark and Greenland alone to decide matters concerning their territory. That's 7 major European governments issuing a unified rebuttal. Behind the scenes, the reaction has reportedly been even more intense. European officials have described a state of near panic over Trump's persistence. According to reports, Denmark's Prime Minister Frederiksen was visibly frazzled after a phone call with Trump that was described as horrendous. He reportedly threatened tariffs during the conversation. This is not normal diplomatic friction. This is active destabilization of a decades-old alliance. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has tried to thread a needle. He's avoided directly criticizing Trump while emphasizing collective Arctic defense against Russia and China through patrols and exercises. But even Rutte's measured statements acknowledge the underlying tension. NATO ambassadors met in closed sessions and agreed to reinforce the Arctic region through intelligence and surveillance. The alliance is preparing for a scenario where this dispute escalates. And now let's talk about what Greenland actually is. Because this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about people. Greenland is the world's largest island, with a population of about 57,000. Approximately 90% of its residents are Inuit. It's a semi-autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Under a 2009 Self-Government Act, Greenland controls domestic affairs, education, health, natural resources, while Denmark retains authority over foreign policy, defense, and currency. This arrangement was designed to give Greenlanders increasing autonomy while preserving the benefits of Danish support, and those benefits are substantial. Denmark provides an annual block grant of over $500 million, which constitutes more than half of Greenland's public budget and about 20% of its economy. The island's primary industry is fisheries, which account for roughly 90% of exports. The economy is small and highly dependent on Danish subsidies. There's also been a long-running movement toward full independence. A January 2025 poll found that 56% of Greenlanders would vote yes to independence in a hypothetical referendum. But support drops significantly to just 35% if independence would lead to a decline in living standards. This reflects a pragmatic understanding that full sovereignty comes with financial risk. All 6 major Greenlandic political parties support eventual independence from Denmark, but timelines vary. Some want to move quickly. Others prefer a gradual approach that prioritizes economic self-sufficiency first. The March 2025 election highlighted these divisions, with environmental policies and resource management dominating the campaign. And here's the critical point. Despite this desire for independence from Denmark, Greenlanders overwhelmingly reject the idea of becoming part of the United States. Polls consistently show around 85% opposition to U.S. integration. Only 6 to 8% are in favor. When asked to choose between Danish and American citizenship, 55% chose Danish. Just 8% chose American. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen has been direct. Greenland will not be part of the USA. He's affirmed a preference for Denmark, NATO, and the EU while remaining open to peaceful dialogue. Former Greenlandic Prime Minister Mut Borup Egede was even blunter. Greenland is ours. We are not for sale. Local sentiment matches this. Residents in the capital Nuuk have expressed anger and fear over Trump's rhetoric. One former politician, Tilly Martinussen, compared Trump's approach to treating Greenlanders like prostitutes, a reference to the transactional nature of the offer and the dismissal of Greenlandic agency. Jens Danielson, a local resident, said he fears U.S. control could make the Greenlandic language disappear very quickly. This isn't a population waiting for rescue. This is a population saying no. And Trump's response to that rejection is part of what's escalating the situation. When asked about Greenland's prime minister asserting that the territory would not be part of the U.S., Trump called it a big problem and rejected it outright. He didn't acknowledge Greenlandic preferences. He dismissed them. This dismissal fits a broader pattern. Trump has framed Greenland as a real estate asset to be acquired rather than a self-governing territory with its own population and political will. That framing echoes colonial-era logic, and it has not gone unnoticed. Critics, both in Europe and within the U.S., have pointed out that you cannot advocate for Ukrainian sovereignty against Russian aggression while simultaneously threatening to seize Danish territory. Now let's examine the strategic rationale that Trump and his administration are relying on. Because even setting aside the diplomatic chaos, there is a security argument being made, and it deserves scrutiny. Greenland's location is militarily significant. It sits in what's called the Guyuk Gap, the ocean corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This gap is a natural choke point for monitoring naval traffic, particularly submarine movements between the Arctic and the North Atlantic. During the Cold War, it was considered vital for tracking Soviet submarines. Today, the concern is Russian naval modernization and China's growing interest in the Arctic. Pituffik Space Base, the only U.S. military installation in Greenland, plays a key role in missile defense. Its upgraded early warning radar provides 240-degree coverage for detecting intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This system feeds real-time data to NORAD and provides 10 to 15 minutes of warning time against missiles traveling over the polar route, which is the shortest path between Russia and the continental United States. Trump has tied this to his proposed Golden Dome missile defense initiative. The argument is that Greenland serves as a northern shield, and full U.S. control would enhance security in a way that shared arrangements cannot. Climate change adds another layer. Arctic sea ice is melting at record rates. In 2025, Arctic temperatures rose 1.37 degrees Celsius above average, the highest in recorded history. This warming is opening new shipping routes. The Northwest Passage, which runs along North America's coast, including Greenland's waters, could become commercially viable for Asia-Europe trade, potentially cutting transit times by weeks and bypassing traditional choke points like the Suez Canal. If these routes become major arteries of global commerce, control over Greenland would translate into control over critical maritime infrastructure. The U.S. is not the only power that sees this. Russia is already investing heavily in its northern sea route along the Siberian coast. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and launched its Polar Silk Road initiative, part of the Belt and Road strategy. Trump's administration has specifically cited these developments as threats. The argument is that if the U.S. doesn't take Greenland, Russia or China will establish dominance in the region. Officials have pointed to Chinese investment proposals in Greenland, including attempts to develop rare earth mining operations, and they've referenced Russian military modernization on the Kola Peninsula and increased submarine activity near Arctic waters. But here's where the argument becomes more complicated. China's infrastructure projects in Greenland have largely stalled. Local regulations and U.S. pressure pushed back on proposals like Chinese investment in airports and mining. Greenland reinstated a ban on uranium mining in 2021, partly due to environmental and health concerns associated with Chinese-linked projects. The imminent Chinese takeover that Trump implies does not have strong evidence behind it. Russia is a more serious competitor in the Arctic, but it has focused its energy on the northern sea route along its own coastline, not on territorial claims to Greenland. Russia benefits from climate change opening its own waters. It doesn't need Greenland to project Arctic power. And the U.S. already has access. The 1951 defense agreement with Denmark allows for U.S. military expansion in Greenland. Patuxent Space Base operates under this framework. If the U.S. wanted more installations, it could negotiate for them under existing agreements. Ownership is not required for security access. This is a point that analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies have made explicitly. In their assessment, the U.S. already has the cake-and-eat-it-too arrangement, military access without the burdens of governance. Full acquisition would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, strain alliances, and likely provoke the very independence movement Trump claims to be preempting, and it would violate international law. Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. Coercing a NATO ally into ceding territory, whether through military pressure or economic threats, undermines the post-World War II legal order that the U.S. itself helped construct. Critics have drawn parallels to Russian justifications for annexing Crimea: strategic necessity, historical claims, the need to protect a sphere of influence. This comparison has been raised not just by adversaries, but by U.S. allies who are now questioning American consistency on sovereignty norms. Let's talk about the money again. Because the $700 billion figure isn't just a headline, it reflects a real calculation and real obstacles. The estimate from NBC News accounts for Greenland's territory, its strategic value, and its mineral wealth. Greenland holds vast deposits of rare earth elements, including some of the world's largest outside of China. These materials are critical for electronics, batteries, wind turbines, and defense technology. China currently controls 40 to 90% of the global rare earth supply chain, depending on the specific element. Greenland's deposits could theoretically reduce that dependence, but extraction faces severe challenges. Greenland's environment is harsh, with most deposits located under ice or in remote areas with no infrastructure. Mining operations would require massive upfront investment. The island has only 93 miles of paved roads. Labor is scarce, weather windows are short, and local opposition to large-scale mining is strong. The 2025 Greenlandic election was shaped by these issues. The winning party, Inuit Ataqatigiit, ran on a platform of protecting fisheries and tourism over mining. The reinstated uranium ban reflects broader environmental concerns. Even if the U.S. acquired Greenland, it would face the same obstacles, and likely more resistance from a population that didn't want to be acquired in the first place. The $700 billion also assumes a purchase, but there's no willing seller. Denmark has made clear that Greenland is not for sale. Greenland's leaders have made the same point. Under Greenland's Self-Government Act, the path to full independence is through a referendum, decided by Greenlanders, not negotiated by external powers. There are alternative arrangements that could address U.S. security interests without full ownership. A compact of free association, similar to U.S. agreements with Pacific nations like the Marshall Islands, would provide military access and economic support in exchange for defense cooperation. These arrangements are less costly and less politically explosive than outright acquisition, but Trump has dismissed partial solutions. He wants full control, and that position is what's driving the crisis. Denmark has responded by accelerating its own military presence in Greenland. In January 2026, the Danish government announced new ships, jets, drones, and a headquarters in Nuuk to bolster Arctic defense. Denmark has invested over 42 billion kroner since 2025 to strengthen its Greenlandic capabilities. This is partly a response to Russian and Chinese interest in the region, but it's also a signal to the United States. Denmark is preparing to defend its territory against anyone. France has announced plans to open a consulate in Greenland as a political signal against U.S. aggression. The United Kingdom, Germany, and France have reportedly discussed potential defensive deployments to Greenland. EU mutual assistance clauses could theoretically be invoked if the U.S. took military action. This would create an unprecedented scenario: a NATO member invoking European Union defense provisions against another NATO member. The United Kingdom has reportedly declined U.S. requests to participate in any potential invasion, opting instead for joint defense planning with European allies. This is the same UK that holds $700 billion in U.S. debt, a figure that could become relevant if economic retaliation enters the picture. Within the U.S., there's bipartisan resistance. Legislation passed by Congress prohibits using defense funds for any annexation effort without Allied consent. Some Republican lawmakers have warned that aggressive action on Greenland would damage U.S. credibility in alliances. Polling shows only 1 in 5 Americans support Trump's efforts to acquire Greenland, while 66% are concerned about damaging alliances. This isn't a popular initiative domestically. It's a presidential priority being pushed against both international and internal resistance. And here's where the story stands as of now. The January 14th talks between Vance, Rubio, and the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers were framed as de-escalation efforts. The goal, reportedly, was to find accommodations that satisfy U.S. security demands without requiring a transfer of sovereignty. Options being discussed include expanding U.S. base access under the 1951 agreement, granting more favorable terms for mineral extraction, or increasing defense cooperation. But Trump's public statements undercut any notion of compromise. Calling anything less than full control unacceptable leaves no room for negotiation, and Greenland's leaders have already rejected the premise. A U.S. official told media that action on Greenland could come within weeks or months, potentially starting with negotiations but escalating if rebuffed. This timeline suggests the administration is not treating this as a long-term diplomatic project. It's treating it as an imminent priority. What comes next depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. If Trump backs off and accepts a negotiated enhancement of U.S. military access, the immediate crisis could de-escalate. Denmark and Greenland might agree to expanded cooperation in exchange for security guarantees and economic incentives. If Trump continues to insist on full control, the standoff will intensify. European allies have signaled they will support Denmark. NATO's cohesion will be tested, and the legal and institutional frameworks that govern international relations will face pressure they weren't designed to withstand. If the U.S. takes unilateral action, economic coercion, sanctions, or military pressure, the consequences are unpredictable. Allies would be forced to choose between supporting a fellow member under attack and maintaining relations with the United States. The post-World War II order would fracture. And through all of this, Greenland itself, the 57,000 people who actually live there, would have the least say in what happens to their home. That's the part that gets lost in the geopolitical chess match. Greenland is not an empty piece of land. It's a society with its own history, its own politics, its own aspirations, and those aspirations include independence, but independence on their terms, not imposed by an external power that views them as a strategic asset. The island is warming, the ice is melting, the resources beneath are becoming more accessible, and that has made Greenland valuable in ways it wasn't a generation ago. But valuable to whom, and at what cost? Trump has made his position clear. Anything less than full U.S. control is unacceptable. The talks have begun. The estimates are on the table, and the alliance that has defined Western security for nearly 80 years is being tested by one of its own members. What happens next is not determined, but the trajectory is visible, and the institutions designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis are now being asked to manage it. The outcome will shape more than Greenland's future. It will shape what kind of international order exists on the other side of this moment. And right now, no one knows what that order will look like. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of how this could actually unfold, because the theoretical scenarios people discuss, purchase, negotiation, coercion, military action, each carry their own logic and their own consequences. A negotiated purchase would require Denmark's consent. Denmark has said Greenland is not for sale, but more fundamentally, it would require Greenland's consent. Under the 2009 Self-Government Act, Greenlanders have the legal right to pursue independence through a referendum. Any transfer of sovereignty would need to go through that process. You cannot sell a territory whose population has constitutional rights to self-determination. Even if Denmark were somehow willing to negotiate, which it isn't, the population would have to vote for it. And they've made clear they won't. So the purchase path is essentially closed unless public opinion in Greenland fundamentally shifts. And Trump's aggressive rhetoric has pushed opinion in the opposite direction. There's also the historical context that informs Greenlandic resistance. Denmark's colonial history in Greenland includes forced sterilization programs between 1966 and 1991 that affected thousands of Inuit women. This history has not been forgotten. It shapes how Greenlanders view external powers claiming to know what's best for them. When Trump dismisses their preferences as a big problem, he's echoing a pattern they've experienced before. The economic coercion path is what some analysts believe is most likely. Trump has already threatened tariffs against Denmark. The U.S. could impose economic pressure designed to make maintaining Greenland financially untenable for Copenhagen. The theory would be that if the costs become high enough, Denmark might reconsider. But this strategy has problems. Denmark is a wealthy country with a diversified economy. It can absorb economic pressure, and European allies have signaled they would support Denmark against U.S. coercion. The EU has mechanisms for collective economic response. Pushing Denmark into a corner might not produce capitulation. It might produce a unified European front. And then there's the military option that Trump has refused to rule out. What would that actually look like? Greenland has no military of its own. Denmark's military presence on the island is small, a few hundred personnel, some patrol vessels, and limited air assets. The U.S. could theoretically occupy the island with minimal resistance, but that's not the question. The question is what happens afterward. A U.S. military occupation of Danish territory would trigger Article 5 obligations in reverse. Denmark could invoke collective defense. NATO members would face an impossible choice: support the alliance framework against the United States or abandon an ally to American aggression. Either option destroys the alliance. The European Union's Mutual Defense Clause, Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union, could also be invoked. This would obligate EU members to provide aid and assistance to Denmark. Suddenly, the United States would not just be in conflict with Denmark, it would be in conflict with the entire European Union. This is why analysts at the Atlantic Council have called this NATO's potential darkest hour. Not because Russia is pressuring the alliance from outside, but because the United States is pressuring it from within. There's one more dimension to this that deserves attention. Trump's push for Greenland is happening alongside other territorial rhetoric. He's talked about taking control of the Panama Canal. He's floated making Canada the 51st state. He recently ordered military action in Venezuela. This isn't an isolated interest in Greenland. It's part of a broader pattern that some have called American expansionism. That pattern matters for how allies interpret the Greenland situation. If this were just about Arctic security, there might be room for negotiation. But if it's part of a worldview that treats allied territory as potentially available for acquisition, the implications are much larger. European capitals are watching not just what happens with Greenland, but what it signals about the future of U.S. relationships with all allies. The irony is that Trump's approach may be producing the opposite of his stated goals. He says he wants Greenland to prevent Russian and Chinese influence. But his aggressive tactics are pushing Greenland closer to Denmark and Europe, not the United States. They're accelerating European defense cooperation. They're strengthening the very independence movement that could eventually take Greenland out of the Western alliance entirely if handled badly. Greenlanders want self-determination. That's real. But self-determination means they get to choose their partners, and right now they're choosing not to be American. The question that remains is whether Trump will accept that answer. His public statements suggest he won't. His administration is treating this as a near-term priority, not a long-term aspiration. The talks that began on January 14th are the opening move in what could become an extended confrontation. Denmark is preparing for that possibility. Europe is preparing for it. Even some elements within the U.S. government are preparing for it, hence the bipartisan legislation blocking defense funds for annexation without consent. What nobody has prepared for is a scenario where the United States actually follows through, because following through would mean accepting consequences that no administration has been willing to accept since the alliance was founded. The post-World War II order was built on the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other. They compete economically. They disagree politically, but they don't use force to take each other's territory. That principle has held for 80 years. Trump is testing whether it will hold for 81. The outcome will depend on decisions made in Washington, Copenhagen, and Newark over the coming weeks and months. It will depend on whether European allies maintain their unity. It will depend on whether Congress exercises its authority. It will depend on whether the Greenlandic population continues to reject American advances. And it will depend on whether the institutions designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis still have the strength to do so. That's what's at stake. Not just an island, not just an alliance, but the rules that have governed relationships between democracies for nearly a century. The talks have started, the demands have been made, and the world is watching to see what happens next.